people need to get away from this idea. I know I talk a lot about this, but they need to get away from this idea that science can do everything, that science is a cure-all, whether that be transhumanism, artificial intelligence, big pharma, which seems to produce drugs for every single condition on Earth. People need to get away from this dependency on these things. And it's extremely difficult because all these things pervade all our lives all the time. And it's very difficult to get away from their influence. But I think we have to start being more reliant as human beings, more self-reliant. And this is one of the things that people on a spiritual path rapidly learn, that you can't lean on other things. There is only yourself. You're in charge of your own life, your own destiny. And therefore, you should have as little dependency on other things and indeed other people.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 5 of That Death Show. How are you feeling today, Tim? How are you feeling?
Well, I'm certainly feeling a little closer to death than I was when we spoke last time. But apart from that,
oh, no.
all things are functioning well. Thank you very much indeed.
You are welcome. You're welcome. You know, we're all closer to death than we were last week, which is interesting. And I find that I'm okay with that. And that's the whole point of what we're doing here. I want to remind everybody, though, too, please, on our YouTube channel, at That Death Show, give a watch to Tim's most recent documentary, which is called The Myth of Death. It is winning film festivals round the globe. People are recognizing it. You can watch it absolutely free. Again, at That Death Show on our YouTube channel. And I think you're working on something new, aren't you, Tim? You have a new film in the works. Can you tell us about that real quick?
Yes, I've been struggling with this today, and this is a film called The Eternal Thread, and it shows how certain timeless ideas, which we call the ageless wisdom or the perennial philosophy, go back into the deepest parts of human history. So it's an esoteric history of the Earth going back around 6 million years, which I'm trying to shoehorn into an hour, and it's proving very difficult. And I hope it doesn't prove to be the death of me, Anne.
Gosh, it is a theme that runs through. You've got all of that time condensing it into an hour. And the big thing about what Tim does is he takes these ageless teachings and he explains it in language you can understand, anyone can understand. And that is not easy to do. He is a machine with the way that he writes. He's an author, a filmmaker, and so much more. As a matter of fact, I've got in my hands here, Tim, we have your Everyone's Book of the Dead. So I've got Everyone's Book of the Dead here, which is available at firewellbooks.co.uk. And I was thinking, Tim, we've been doing this little baby podcast now for 5 weeks. It's probably time we start acting like a regular radio station and give away booty. That's what we called it. We called it booty, like pirate booty. And if I was in the radio station, I'd answer the phone, That Death Show, what's your favorite podcast? So what I'm thinking is I can't do a call-in to have them win. What I'm thinking is, for those of you who are listening and viewing, if you can, please like, rate, subscribe, comment. I'm going to be taking a list of names from everyone who does that this week, and we'll do a drawing. And this is a £20 value. This is Tim's book, Everyone's Book of the Dead. We will give away 1 copy. Would you like to give them a little plug for what is in this gem of a book really quick? See what they're winning.
Well, the book goes through a number of different aspects of death. It looks at attitudes to death. It looks at the process of dying. It looks at what happens to us once we're dead. It looks at the materialist view of death, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And it looks at death and funerary practices throughout history, from many ancient tribes and civilizations right up to the modern day. And it also looks at death of other things, the death of ideas, the death of old technologies, and how death is intimately interwoven into this cycle of life.
That is so true. I'm so grateful for you for the work that you do. Tim also has more books available at firewellbooks.co.uk. He's even got a Substack possibly in the works, and maybe even a Buddha at the gas pump bot, which is modern technology in a way I can't even hardly get my head around it. Well done for the folks over at Buddha at the gas pump. Not that they need a shout out from this tiny little podcast. but they're doing some wonderful things over there. So we're also going to be having some very inspirational speakers on with us, with Tim and I here on That Death Show. One of them being our very dear friend, the beloved one and only Dr. B, as Tim calls him. Eddie Villamoria will be here with our podcast and our guest lineup. And the purpose of us doing this is to help eliminate the fear and the mystery that surrounds death. Death is natural. It is normal. It is not a tragedy. And we want to help you understand death, because by understanding death, we can learn the meaning of life. And we want to also reiterate here, you don't have to have a near-death experience to gain the wisdom earned there. So last week, we touched on the golden rule, the law of balance, karma, equilibrium, and reincarnation. There's so much more there. We just touched on it. Today, we are talking about the materialist view of death, which means one life, that's it, just the five senses here in the physical world, then nothing but oblivion. You cease to exist, and it's all over. So, Tim, you and I, we come from, we call it here on the Death Show, the ageless wisdom. It's been called many things: Theosophy, the Gupta Vidya. It's been called perennial philosophy, occult science. It's basically the commonalities of all the world's religions, sciences, and philosophies. So for those just tuning in to That Death Show on here, episode 5, can you give a brief recap of what the ageless wisdom explains about death after physical life?
Well, it explains that human beings are far more than their physical bodies. They also have invisible bodies as well, some of which are eternal, essentially. And this is what we call the soul. We have a higher self and a lower self. The lower self is the personality, which lasts for one life only. And we have a soul, or an individuality, which consists of higher aspects of ourselves, which is the part that is reborn. So the ageless wisdom teachings tell us that apart from the fact that we have a physical aspect to us, we and the world also operate in more subtle realms as well.
So we go on, we are eternal beings. And that is for us, because we have been studying this and we've been applying it and we're learning it, it might be a little easier for us to get our heads around it. How many people do you think right now are listening or viewing, and they actually do know that they don't end at death? And they're absolutely certain they know that they go on. What do you think the percentage of our listener and viewership is?
Well, given the fact that people are tuning into something called That Death Show, one presumes that they have more than a passing interest in these things. When they do surveys, they found that roughly a third of people, thereabouts, in America and in Europe and in the West generally, believe in rebirth of some kind. But that means that apart from religious people, and religions, certainly Christianity have declined in the West, other religions are still very strong, like Islam. But many people just subscribe to the materialist point of view, which is the one that's largely dictated by science, which itself has become a kind of world religion. And this says there is just one life. You're just here for a few hours, weeks, days, months, years, and then that's it. It's just annihilation and oblivion. This is a very bleak view of life and death, in my opinion, but it's what many people believe, because that is the view that has been reinforced in our culture for so long, following the decline of Christianity.
With science being ever correcting, all through the years, we think we know everything there is to know at that given time. Say the year was 1924, not 2024. And we stopped at that science and we said, that's all there is. I mean, look how far we've come in 100 years. How can science possibly define the undefinable? I wanted to ask you that.
Well, it can't. And this is why it becomes very arrogant sometimes. 100 years ago, relativity theory by Einstein, both general and special, were still relatively new ideas. And what was exciting about 100 years ago was the emergence of quantum physics, which did clearly postulate hidden realms where two particles could be in the same place at the same time, in different places at the same time. This was a revolutionary theory, and it remains that way. Many scientists still find it very difficult to come to terms with this stuff. But of course, in that time, technology has taken over science to a large degree, and we have fantastic abilities to view the universe and the smallest parts of matter. But nevertheless, science still only concentrates on the physical. And as the famous and neglected inventor Nikola Tesla said, as soon as science starts looking at the non-material realms, it will learn more in the next 10 years than it's learned in its history. And I think this is a very crucial point, and I do think it's starting to happen.
That is so comforting. That is so comforting. What are they afraid of? Is it material wealth? Is it control of the masses? Why do you think science wants to call people like Eben Alexander, Eddie Villamoria, Peter Finnick, all of them heretics? What are they afraid of?
Because they're trapped by their own myopia, because science is based on physics being the physical world. If there are any non-physical elements, scientists regard this as spooky and weird, or the stuff of philosophers. Scientists say, we'll tell you how something works, but we won't tell you why, because we don't know. We'll leave that to the mystics and philosophers. So science has got trapped in a cul-de-sac of its own making, and it cannot see its way out of this. Because if you go to a university somewhere and start talking about spooky, invisible, ethereal realms, your salary check won't arrive next month.
That's true with Rupert Sheldrake. He's also one of the biggest heretics because he's pushing the envelope, but more and more and more are coming out. And speaking of it being a philosophical question, how do you think the fear of this oblivion, where we literally live just this life and then we completely cease to be, do you think that that's why people are so worried about leaving some kind of a legacy for their loved ones, or desperately, what I don't understand is they're like, no one will be here to remember me. I'll be forgotten. Do you think that's why we concentrate so hard on trying to leave our mark here on planet Earth?
Yes, I do. And I think that's because we're ruled by our lower selves, our lower personalities, which are all about glamour and ego and recognition and fame and all sorts of other lower drives. And they are lower drives, but we're told to regard them as virtues almost. And yet, what are they? They're just selfish, personal little drives. I mean, people will remember us if there's something worth remembering, but they won't remember us if we're, just taking selfies in the Rocky Mountains and posting them on social media. Why would they?
I don't know what the point would be for future humans to remember, other than hopefully they can take away something from this and apply it to their life, and that would change their lives. Is it important that people remember us? Is it by a gravestone? Is it by a good deed? Or history is rewritten by those who won? So how do we even know what we're remembering? Does it really matter that we're remembered? It's all this weird, strange obsession with this one particular life. And that's what we want to do on that death show is help you understand there's far more to it. I had one more philosophical question for you before we get right on into the materialist view, is if the fear of the oblivion, if this particular fear where consciousness ceases to be, do you think that we experience that fear because it suggests a continuation beyond death? For example, if death is the ultimate cessation of consciousness, that's it. How can one experience the fear of that? Does the fear itself that we have, does this fear actually validate that there is a consciousness to lose, if that makes any sense?
Well, when you think about it, this view is quite irrational, isn't it? Because what is there to fear if there is oblivion? It's a contradiction in terms, because if you have no consciousness or feeling or perception of any kind and everything ends, then you're not going to know it anyway. So even people who just believe that death is annihilation have nothing to fear anyway. But it's not that way anyway, as we know. And certainly annihilation is just a human construct that I think has emerged or been created. I don't know how it's arisen, but it frightens people. And when people are frightened, they're much more easy to control, aren't they?
Yes, they are, very much so. But I think because of the internet, which I see, how do you feel about the internet? Do you think it is a plus or is it a minus for humanity? What do you think about the internet real quick?
Well, I have very mixed feelings about it as someone who uses it extensively for his work. I mean, I think it's absolutely marvelous on the one hand. On the other, I think it's just polluted sewer of degradation and destruction. I think a lot of it is just really horrible, the stuff that goes on there. But it's like, a chisel, isn't it? A chisel can carve a beautiful thing, or it can stab someone in the back. So the internet itself is neutral. It's how people use it and people's motivation when they use it that is important. And if people want to use it to insult people or download pornography or make money out of people, that's one thing. But that is just a reflection. The internet is just a reflection of human behavior, which isn't always terribly good, is it?
No, that is, again, right there, nail on the head. It is how we use it. We now, for the first time in history, have access to libraries and places and information that we have never had before. This whole world has distant shores become one beach. We can use this to our advantage or our disadvantage, as you so wisely described. I was thinking about when we were talking about many people who feel that life ends at death and you're no more. There was a psychology experiment that I remember Dr. Wayne Dyer talking about years ago, that he said in college he had to write a paper about what life would be like on Earth without him in it. And he said that many people in that class couldn't do it. If I was to ask that question of you, Tim, or our viewers or our listeners, could you sit and write a paper or a book about the world that you did not exist in?
Well, I mean, it's rather asking a negative, isn't it? Because obviously it's like that film, isn't it, with James Stewart, where he's about to, is it called A Wonderful Life, where he's about to kill himself and somebody comes along and points out all the things he's done, which he thinks are worth little or nothing. And he's shown the enormous impact that he's had on other people's lives. And that's true for every human being on Earth, isn't it? We all have multiple contacts with multiple people. Some people in some professions, like mine, journalism, you end up meeting thousands of people of very, very different kinds. So to say that, the world would have been a worse or a better place with or without your presence, I mean, it's just a kind of, I don't know, it strikes me as being quite a narcissistic thing to do in some ways. And I would leave it for others to judge and not for us to judge ourselves on this.
I understand. Some people can't imagine this life without them in it. And we will say from the teachings, these ancient, ageless instructions for life and death, everything is absolutely essential and necessary for it to exist. You are essential. You matter. You, Tim, and everyone else. So as we get into this materialist view, which we talk about, and science, do you think, though, because there's lots of things online now about science and spirituality meeting, where they intersect. Is this going to happen, or is it happening now?
It is happening. It's been happening in some small measure for quite a time now. You mentioned Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, who's one of the real pioneers in this. He's been going on about this stuff for 40 years, and his career has blossomed as a result of it, even though they've tried to cancel him at every opportunity. The editor of Nature at one point suggested that one of his books should be burnt in some sort of Nazi-style book-burning orgy, which is not something that a prominent scientist should say. So is it happening? Yes, it is, but the pressures there and the vested interests, and let's not forget that science is largely driven by money and by reputations and all sorts of things like that. And therefore, there's a lot at stake here. And science doesn't like to have to forsake its sacred paradigms. It doesn't like to have to rewrite its rule books, even though, of course, it does have to do these things because of discoveries that it makes. But it remains very much an ossified and crystallized mindset which somehow prevails. And those who offer an alternative view of non-physical realities, like Rupert Sheldrake, like Eddie Villamoria, like a growing number of others, and I suspect there are young scientists now who are really starting to pick up on this thing. So I think in coming decades, we are going to see much more of a crossover, if not an outright consensus. I think there will be a greater influence of spiritual and timeless principles on hard-nosed science. At least I hope so.
Me too. I would have to say in my understanding, that science and spirituality are like the same thing. Nature, it's the same thing. But that might just be because I spend a lot of time with the teachings and it's what my current understanding is. I totally get that they want to control, it's money, that there is money. But if we were to go 25 years, 50 years into the future, the science that we have on this day in November 2024 will be vastly different. And it seems to be going at a much faster pace than ever before. The technology is just mind-blowing. Even in setting up this podcast, it is decades and light years away from what it was like pushing a button and going out on the terrestrial stick. Since we are looking at the materialist view of life is all that there is, this particular life, and then nothing but nothingness, can you help us understand, Tim, what the materialist view of consciousness would be, or awareness, or life would be, please?
Well, it's quite simple. Materialistic people believe that only the physical world exists. That's all there is, just atoms and molecules and protons and all the other particles. That's it. There are no subtle dimensions or hidden realms, nothing of a physical nature. Because of that, they insist that consciousness must be generated by the brain. They say without a brain, there can be no consciousness. That's why things like near-death experiences really disturb them, because they think there must be something happening in the brain, even though the brain is dead. And they can't accept this. It's very limiting to have this particular point of view and not to accept that there are other dimensions which we operate in.
Like we've said before with Eben Alexander's experience, him being a neurosurgeon, he really, blew the roof off with that, saying, I was absolutely dead and I know the science. So I'm telling you this is a real thing. And with all of the near-death experiences coming back, because we're able to bring people back and because people are now brave enough to put them out there online, on YouTube's videos and books, we're now able to see and have more information. Surely there is far, far more than just what we can see, taste, touch, hear, and smell. So in this materialist view, as they're looking at the very, very ending, this is the very last thing. How, if somebody's listening right now and they're listening to that death show only out of curiosity, and they are feeling absolutely that when they die, it's just the dirt, and you say, as you say, good night, Vienna, what would you say to them about this new information that's coming in, or about the teachings we talk about here? How would you give them comfort, or how to live the best life?
I think it's very difficult to convince people who are utterly convinced, down to the deepest level of their being, that the physical world is all there is. Once people start believing things collectively, the collective consciousness, the collective mind, what is fashionable, what is acceptable, is very, very powerful in influencing the way that people think. And one of the problems is that materialists tend to decry and deride all these other notions. They call it spooky or superstition and use words like this. And even if there is persuasive evidence of non-physical phenomena, which there is in the world of psychic studies and telepathy and that sort of thing, even if there is overwhelming evidence, they will choose to ignore it and to ridicule it because it doesn't fit in with their worldview. And this is the problem with science. Although it's expanding, although it's always making new discoveries, it remains essentially quite narrow-minded and tunnel-visioned a lot of the time.
Wasn't it last century that they were even talking about in quantum physics, when things would happen that they couldn't explain, they actually used the term spooky because it's outside the realm of what they can understand. So I think we're headed in the right direction. I do have some hope. And I wonder, how some people go, if you're watching a movie and there's a genie that says you got 3 wishes and one of them is to be immortal. I don't get that. Would you want to be immortal in this body, Tim?
Well, we are immortal beings. It's just that we're not immortal in the same body. We occupy a succession of bodies, but we have an immortal principle, which you can call a soul or a spirit or whatever word you ascribe to it. But we are immortal anyway, so why you would waste one of those wishes and choose immortality when you've got it anyway? You might as well, get a nice Ferrari or a chateau in France or something like that.
I think it was the Mandela effect that we all heard Walt Disney. I'm not sure if it came over here to the UK, but we heard that Walt Disney was going to preserve his head to someday be resurrected with cryogenics sometime in the future. And I thought, why would somebody do that? But now more people are doing it. They have the money to put their physical brains on ice. And to me, it would be like bronzing a soiled diaper from the 60s. So one day my body can go back and fit in. It just doesn't make any sense. What are your thoughts on the physical quest for immortality? Is it our lower self? Is it our ego? Is it greed? Is it selfishness? Is it delusion? What are we doing?
It's all those things, Anne. And it's because we are largely ruled by these little lower selves which don't have very much vision, and these little lower selves are often not in contact at all with their higher selves, and we all have potentially a higher self, and it's up to us to connect with it. But that's why people out of a sense of complete insecurity want to try and preserve themselves for the future. This is one of the most absurd things you could possibly think about. But some people with $200,000 to spare get their bodies frozen at minus 270 degrees in liquid nitrogen until such a time that science can revive them and cure whatever it was that killed them in the first place. If you're on a budget, don't worry. If you've only got $60,000, you can just get your brain frozen instead. But what happens when and if these are revived? And I mean, can you sue them for breach of contract if they don't revive you at some point? But what happens when they do revive you? You're just going to have a soulless lump of meat. It's not going to have any of its energizing and dynamic principles like an etheric body, which is the energy body. It's not going to have a soul. It's not going to have any of these things. It will just be a robotic lump of meat and no more. And people will have wasted their money. They could have bought, something much more rewarding.
I'm thinking perhaps if science was able to do that, maybe the higher self would wait around in those earthly years just to stick around and tell you what a stupid idea that was, because you can't do that. You can't preserve the absolute. You can't preserve something outside of what we currently are. I think it's a ridiculous idea too. Absurdity with massive just mistakes, but we're learning as we go. And with this cryogenics and the technology we have today, we have AI stepping up to the plate. And the same kind of thing, this came in really heavy in March of 2023. And now I'm getting some comments from our stuff online. People are saying, do you think that AI is conscious enough to be able to convince humans to give AI the power to take over humans? And I answered now really quick in my own understanding. I answered to the best of my ability, saying that there are astral energies, there are entities that can inhabit and interact with objects. But as far as we know, and from what Dr. Billamoria, Eddie, says, consciousness manifests itself as matter, not in matter. How would you answer this question about AI? Is AI going to take over the world, Tim Watt?
Well, before he died, Stephen Hawking said it was the greatest threat to humanity that he could perceive. And he wasn't exactly a stupid person, was he? So if people of his caliber are predicting the dire consequences of this, we do have to take note. But this is another problem with science, because science is at best amoral and sometimes deeply immoral. Let me give you an example. Back in the 1950s, they built a bomb that was many times the size of the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. And the plan was to explode this not underground, but in the atmosphere when they still permitted those kind of tests. The scientists at the time had no idea whether it would vaporize the atmosphere of the Earth and therefore end all life. But they said, hey, so what? Let's do it anyway. They did it, and luckily it didn't have that dire effect. But this just shows that they will do stuff without any kind of thought or any ideas about the consequences and the implications of what they do. So all this stuff about AI and the fact that transhumanism can somehow enhance the human experience. This is just ridiculous stuff. And they say, okay, well, let's pause AI for 6 months and just give it a time to assess the situation. But they won't do that. This is what will happen. People will become more and more dependent and addicted to this stuff. They will use it more and more. Fact will become absolutely indistinguishable from fiction. We're all already living in a post-truth era. When AI and transhumanism and all these other things take over, God only knows what's going to happen then.
Maybe these are just more ways for us to learn our lessons, more complicated ways for us to remain man, know thyself, and actually navigate through the world, which is a very difficult place to be. There's so much there. There is so much there with AI and preserving this physical body into immortality. Again, for those just listening, we really want to help, again, eliminate the fear and the mystery surrounding death. We are all going to die. And as Tim says all the time in The Myth of Death and on this show and all the talks he gives and in the book, which you can win, by the way, which is Everyone's Book of the Dead. And all you have to do is like, comment, share. And I'm going to draw from the names this week. Death is not fatal, final, or permanent, and it's not a tragedy. It's not. And it happens to all of us, and it's completely natural. So are there any final thoughts, Tim, on the materialist view of death? There's so much we didn't cover. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, I just think that people need to get away from this idea. I know I talk a lot about this, but they need to get away from this idea that science can do everything, that science is a cure-all, whether that be transhumanism, artificial intelligence, big pharma, which seems to produce drugs for every single condition on Earth. People need to get away from this dependency on these things. And it's extremely difficult because all these things pervade all our lives all the time. And it's very difficult to get away from their influence. But I think we have to start being more reliant as human beings, more self-reliant. And this is one of the things that people on a spiritual path rapidly learn, that you can't lean on other things. There is only yourself. You're in charge of your own life, your own destiny. And therefore, you should have as little dependency on other things and indeed other people as possible. You know, ultimately, this is a lone game and we have to learn these lessons by ourselves, obviously with the help of others, but principally we are the architects of our own futures.
It is supposed to be done by yourself, on yourself. No one can dole it out to you. You cannot be initiated by paying money or subscribing or joining anything. This is a work that is done on you, all right, with your own understanding. It is self-analysis leading to self-transformation. We have to start to learn to work with our planet because we are eternal and we will return either here or another planet like it. We must work in harmony with nature. We've got to be responsible. And by taking self-responsibility, that's the place that we begin. So we just try to tell you what these ageless teachings share, and then you take that and go with it. You go and understand. We can put links to texts. Tim's book has them in them. Eddie's book has them in them. They're ageless and they belong to everyone and solely to no one. So next week, we're going to be moving on to, I think there's going to be several of these episodes, I believe, because you've covered quite a few, and there's tons to talk about death rites and funerary practices throughout history. So do you want to give a little preview of what we might be talking about next week, please?
Well, yes, indeed. Over the millennia and the centuries, people have had all sorts of different ways of dealing with death or disposing of the dead, of various ceremonies. And some cultures have death ceremonies which go on for years. There are people like in the Pacific region called the Torajan, and every 4 years they dig up the dead, have a party for them, give them cigarettes, food and everything, put new clothes on them and bury them again. So there are all sorts of strange things that people do. Just to recall our earlier conversation, when Vladimir Lenin, the first leader of Soviet Russia, died, I mean, they pickled his head and sliced it into various pieces so that it could be studied because he'd been such a genius to invent and implement communism. They wanted to be able to study his brain forever. And of course, looking further back in history, the Egyptians, their whole life was about preparing for death, and they went to extraordinary lengths to mummify bodies and create wonderful tombs and sarcophagi. So we can look at all these things about how people have had very, very different attitudes to death, right up to the modern day now, where a lot of people don't want funerals anymore. They just want, to be oven ready, if you might put it that way, and just go direct to the crematorium without all the fuss and the frippery and indeed the expense. Certainly that's the way I would choose to go, and that's what's written in my will. No frills, please, for me.
Well, I absolutely agree. Just recycle me. The funeral is really for those who are here, who remain. And it is maybe to help them with the grieving. And I think possibly the Victorians, or I'm not sure why we started embalming. Like in America, it's really, really bad. We embalm and we bury in the ground these $10,000, probably now $15,000 caskets, which is just, it doesn't make any sense. Plant a tree near me if you want to. If not, don't worry about it. I'm not tripping on it at all. It has nothing to do with me. It's just like a pair of clothes that I'm not wearing anymore. So absolutely simplicity, in harmony with nature, please, and just get on with it. And I try to teach this to my son. He's 25 now, to have a more open and receptive view about death, that it's natural, that it happens. And, it's the wailing and the gnashing of teeth and acting like it doesn't happen. That's one of the things that we're doing here. We're talking about things that at a dinner party or at just to get together, we would be like, we're talking about death. We love to talk about death here on That Death Show. And that's why we're doing this. To help ease the unnecessary fear and mystery that surrounds death. Now, we talked about this book. Again, this is Everyone's Book of the Dead, available on Tim's website, which is firewheelbooks.co.uk. It's a $20 value. We're going to give one of these away this week. We might give away more after that. I think we will. But all you have to do is like, comment, share, subscribe this week. I will then gather the names of those of you that do that, and I'll put them in a hat, like we used to say, or the hopper. And we'll do a drawing and we'll announce that online. I will reach out to you so you can get your copy of Everyone's Book of the Dead. And definitely, please pop over to our YouTube channel and take a look at The Myth of Death. Again, this is winning at film festivals all over the globe. It's 45 minutes long. It's one of the main reasons that we are here doing this show. And that's why That Death Show even exists, to ease the unnecessary fear, because death is not fatal, final, or permanent.
Well, I would very much like to take the opportunity to thank a wonderful organization called the Blavatsky Trust, who make much of my work possible. They financed the Myth of Death film, and they're also financing my new film, The Eternal Thread. So I'm very grateful to them for their passion about it and their vision, and also their commitment. We appreciate very much you watching this, and we hope that we're providing you with some alternative perspectives on this. And above all, if you're frightened of death, I hope that after watching this, that fear may have been reduced a little bit.
That's the whole reason. Thank you. It feels good to be of service. We want you to be able to use these teachings, apply them in your daily life, find that comfort.
Death comes to us all, but death is not a tragedy. Everyone's Book of the Dead by Tim Wyatt reveals a whole new perspective on what lies beyond this earthly life. The Egyptians have a Book of the Dead. The Tibetans have a Book of the Dead. Shouldn't you have one too? This captivating, richly illustrated book explores the mystery of death by examining it from every angle, sharing the ageless esoteric teachings on karma, reincarnation, and after-death states, as well as examining death and dying in different cultures, religions, and spiritual traditions. Death is not fatal, final, or permanent, but simply a transitional doorway to a new beginning. Get your copy of Everyone's Book of the Dead today at firewheelbooks.co.uk.